We're here today with Charles Biasiny-Rivera, presenting his work and interviewing him in the framework of the exhibition En Foco, the New York Puerto Rican Experience, 1973-1974. This exhibition is very important to the museum. It is a big privilege and honor to have you here with us today. The exhibition presents the totality of photographs of the portfolio that was created by you and your fellow photographers at En Foco in 1973 and 1974, and that was eventually donated to El Museo and constituting one of the most important pieces in our permanent collection, right? So it's really a fantastic occasion for the museum, and we're very lucky to have you and having you sharing your thoughts and recollections about this wonderful work. So thank you so much for being with us, Charlie.
My pleasure.
So we thought we would start with just asking more on the, from the beginning, right? On a more personal side of things, about your upbringing, about you growing up in New York City.
Well, what I remember of my early years is when we were living in El Barrio. I must have been maybe 1 year old, no, couldn't be. I couldn't remember that. But I was very young, and we lived in one of the tenement buildings there and had a large dog, which I didn't care for at all. I was very small. And I slept in a what do you call it? Actually, it was a blanket.
A hammock?
Yes, right. It was a blanket, which was suspended in a doorway. That was where I slept. And I was terrified of the dog. I don't know why we had it. I guess that's the first time I noticed the smell of my father, which was a sweet, warm odor. And that lasted all through my life. I loved it so much, I used to go into the closet to smell his jacket. Because he was a seaman, a merchant seaman. And so he was gone for a large part of the year. And we were entering the war years. So his trips took maybe 3 months at a time. And that, I really missed him. And I used to go in the closet and smell his clothes because he had a wonderful sweet odor. Those beginnings, I think, were very soft, very pleasant, very caring, sort of typical Latino family. We had relatives, aunts and uncles, and I had cousins. In fact, I grew up with my cousin Edwin, and we hung out like brothers for years. And living in El Barrio, I don't remember at all. Oh, I do remember when I went on a walk with my father. And it seemed he knew everybody, everyone on the block, all the merchants by name. And they never would just say hello. They'd always have to stop and have a little conversation and then move on. And it was so pleasant to be with him. It was so comforting. And then there's a blank after that. And after that, we moved to the Bronx. And that's where I spent my adolescent and my adolescent years. And that was also great. What I liked about that, there was a huge lot, and it was vacant, but full of trees, high grass. And as kids, we would hide in the grass, and then the older boys would come along and hit us on the head. We thought we were safe because the grass was high. Didn't realize they just looked down at you. It was a warm feeling growing up. It was not a Latino neighborhood in the Bronx. It was totally mixed. Italians, Greeks, Jews, just a totality of ethnicities. And we all, they were all neighbors and friends. It was also a very pleasant experience. There were trees I could climb because we were surrounded by green.
Maybe we should talk a little bit also about your education, like formal education during these years in New York.
Yes. We grew up in the standard public schools in New York. PS 23 up in the Bronx is where I first went to school. And then we lived there for a number of years. And about the time I was about 13, we moved back into Manhattan. And I can't quite remember, let's see, yes, I remember now. We moved to West End Avenue around 68th Street. Very nice neighborhood. Again, many nationalities were there. A mixture of the different churches, which I like very much, especially the Greek churches, because they would have a procession celebrating the holy days. And they always had a person that was damaged, physically damaged, carrying the cross. He would walk for blocks with his heavy cross on his back, imitating Christ. It's a strong image. But it was always very nice. The gangs were not really threatening yet. It wasn't until we moved back into Manhattan and lived on Manhattan Avenue around 108th Street that the gangs began. And we all went to a public school in the neighborhood, and that was full of the different populations that was in the neighborhood. So you'd have all these friends in school, but after school, if they were Irish, we were the Puerto Ricans, we didn't get along. After school, we stayed in our own neighborhood.
It sounds like you were already really observing the people around you and the neighborhoods. And I'm wondering, were you always a creative child? Did you know you wanted to be an artist? When did that begin for you?
Those were the war years, the Second World War. And I was too young to, darn it, to join the Marines. So I invented a bomb sight that I could load with marbles. And we lived on sort of the third floor, and I could go out of my fire escape and drop marbles. Yeah. and they were on the neighbors, which they didn't mind. They'd yell at us, but they didn't really mind. I like inventing things. I like thinking of something and then cutting up the cardboard boxes that the cereal came in, and then forming it into something, like the bomb sight I invented. A little piece of mirror, I'd fix it so it could reflect downwards and put a little crosshair on it. I like that. And I still like that. I'm attracted to things that I don't quite understand how they work, but I love to learn how they work. And probably that's what led me into photography. I just love to take pictures.
Well, we'd love to talk about this because Susanna pointed out the sense of observation that I think was present in everything that you were saying. That's very much part of the images we have here. But I was just curious also, how did you get into photography first? Was it the military service?
No, I had a little tiny plastic camera with it took a roll about the size of 35 millimeter, and I'd be taking pictures of the gang, and then I go home and learn how to process the film. I wanted to learn that.
Yeah.
So I got the books out of the library.
Yeah, so we're talking about the 50s there, the early 50s?
That was still in the late 40s.
All right.
In the late 40s, 48, 47, in there. After the Army, I served a stint in the Army. And when I came out, I started taking pictures. And then it became serious and started getting jobs in studios, assisting photographers. And I was very good at it because I understood it all. And many of the photographers were on the young side, and they really didn't have as much experience with the equipment. And the thing about it is, when you're working in a studio, you just can't be familiar with one camera or one light. You have to master the lights, and you have to master the camera and everything that deals with it. Because many of the young photographers that come to work in the studio didn't have that background. And we'd have to show them how to load the cameras. But then we said, oh, I don't want to learn that. You take care of that. Just hand me the camera that's loaded. And I worked for years as an assistant. And I was very fortunate.
Yeah, can we talk about some of the photographers you assisted then?
Oh, gee, there were so many.
The ones that were more relevant for
Yeah,
your
the one that
professional
sticks in my
training.
mind was there was a fellow that would visit from England, and he apparently was a very famous photographer because the studio would set up.
We're talking about Cecil Beaton?
And it turned out, of course, to be Cecil Beaton, and I worked with him, and he liked how I worked. That is to say, I took every care of everything he as a photographer would ordinarily do. I'd have all the film holders loaded, camera set up, the right lens set up, the lights had been set up in a fairly standard, but he'd always say, bring that main light in 4 feet, won't you? I'd slip over and bring it in. We got on very well because whatever he requested, I was capable of doing. And I was the one who loaded the cameras and unloaded it was all sheet film in those days, 8x10.
Yeah.
And everything, he loved the idea of switching into the studio and saying hello to everyone.
That's very interesting because you have like this strong studio background, but I think your work is more known for like documentary, street photography, but I think this is a solid background in terms of like the technical aspect of photography.
Yeah, because if you're going to earn your living as a photographer, generally you'd either work for a magazine and you didn't have much equipment you'd have to haul around. But most of the business in New York City was studio photography. And you really had to know what was going on in the studio and anticipate what was going to happen or what was going to be needed.
And what kind of photos you were shooting then? I mean, was it
Portraits.
Portraits.
Primarily portraits of very well-known individuals. Very well-known individuals. We loved it at the studio. He didn't have a studio of his own. In fact, the only thing he had was an old Rolleiflex. It was an old 2¼ Rolleiflex with the leather peeling. And he started at an early age where you had to mix your own chemicals in photography. And that was an early time in photography. So he was aware. He was aware of the process, but he didn't care to be involved with it. He just wanted to discuss something with the sitter and try to sedate the sitter, calm the sitter, so the muscles in the face would relax. And he was a very good conversationalist. He'd just say, bring the main light in a bit, Charles. And it'd always be a few inches because I knew how he worked. I had studied the photographs he had been taken, the portraits he had done, and I figured out how it was lit.
How were you beginning to balance these sort of day jobs where you were assisting others and then working on your own photography? What was that like?
Well, when you work in a studio, you really have access to it. And they'll give you the keys. You could open up the studio in the morning and have everything, ready. It's as if I have maybe 5 studios and those photographers knew me and I knew them. And they were well-known photographers who had a lot of business. And many times their assistants would be ill, or maybe they had a job on the side, which is what you do when you work. You learn the techniques and then you start building up your own trade. So freelance assisting, you had to develop a reputation. And pretty soon the major photographers knew who you were. And if their people were out sick or something, they immediately would call me in. And it would be very easy for me to fall into a strange studio and quickly size it up and realize what they needed, what format they were shooting with. Many they had different formats. And so you had to be experienced with a lot of equipment, how it worked. And then you got used to how different photographers used light, because that was an individual thing. That's what was their trademark. So I knew about that because I would study that.
Yeah, but I guess Susanna is also trying to get us out of the studio.
Yeah,
right?
It's what we're seeing around us here.
Go to the street, or also talk about like early En Foco history, how that transition from being like a session man, so to speak,
when I came
into being an artist photographer. I think this is where we're trying to get here.
When I met other Latino photographers.
Oh, right. There you go. Yeah.
That's when we started talking about the absence of our presence in the business. There weren't many Latino photographers. So we got together and discussed, well, why don't we just start doing things in photography and see what comes out of it. And we started working doing photographs, for not studio photographs. They were all sort of street shooting. Most of the photographers were doing street shooting. They were doing architectural photography or medical photography. They were primarily street shooting. And there's a sense to street shooting that you really do have to understand when you enter a neighborhood. The neighborhood immediately sees you as a stranger because they know everybody. So you know how to, you don't want to become noticed when you go into a strange neighborhood. You don't want to stand out. So you hang out a little bit, smoke some cigarettes, say good morning, good afternoon to people, see the kids and everything, come back the next day, do the same thing. Oh yeah, why? Oh, you're a photographer. Well, do you have a studio? I said, well, no, not really. I'm just doing what's going on in the street. Oh, that was curious. Why would you do that? How do you get paid? You got a job?
That's interesting.
And if you created a rapport with them, they wouldn't see you as a stranger, and they'd be peering at you all the time. The shades would come up and the shades would go down. And so after a while, they sort of recognize you, familiar, that you weren't a threat or an investigator, because everyone was doing something that was slightly shady. So walking the streets, which you do in street photography, and it's nice to walk in streets that you're familiar with. It's nice to go into the Barrio and photograph everything. You're used to the noises, the sounds, and they're suspicious too. Why are you taking their pictures? But if you speak Spanish, you could get out of that easy. The language is the key. But if you go to another neighborhood, you're really a suspicious character. Think, why are you taking pictures of my kid? So you better have a nice, easy explanation of what you're doing. And you're not a threat. You don't eat babies.
And what were your initial interests, or what were you sort of looking for when you started doing street photography, or when that transition began?
Yeah, it's really an investigatory thing. You don't know what it is you're looking for. I never had any plans. I would just put myself into a situation and see what would happen, how I felt about things, what I found curious about it, what drew me to it. And then certain faces were wonderful. And, you stick a camera in someone's face and you're liable to get a black eye. So you have to have a little rapport about what you're doing. And if you're family oriented, that's always an easy way to explain your interests. And then they'd say, well, you're not a threat. And you could walk around without people always peering at you. Because they always think you're going to run off with their kids.
Yes. Let's talk about En Foco, no?
Yeah.
Let's talk about how did that come about, basically? What's the genesis? How was it born? Who was there? Or who were your fellows at that juncture? And what were your aims with the project?
Yeah. I didn't meet many other assistants or photographers that were Latinos. A lot of Europeans were photographers, but not even, they weren't many assistants that were Latinos. When I did stumble across a few, we had a lot to talk about. Awful lot to talk about. And at one point, we would gather in a bar somewhere in the evening, and we discussed the possibility of forming a photographic group, which didn't exist. I got excited about it a lot, so did the two other fellows, and that was Phil Dante and Frank Impaya. I would stumble and then all of a sudden meet someone, and it's like meeting a brother. And we discuss a lot, and pretty soon we would bump into someone else who was really interested in photography, but wasn't as experienced, but just still interested, and also he had an eye, which is you're always looking for the independent eye. And at one point, Raja Kaban and Phil Dante and I all were taking pictures, and we decided to hang out for a while. And at one point, we said, well, why don't we form a group? If you're a working photographer in commercial photography, you don't have time for that. You're a professional, like a dentist or anything else, and you have to spend your time doing what it is that earns money. But in this case, if you ran into another Latino, you knew that Latino has been going through what you had been going through. That you had to develop the kind of professionalism that ordinarily you don't find in our communities. But then there was a generation of fellows that came out of that, and then we suddenly met each other and decided to come together and start to use our photography and point it to ourselves and our families.
So is the portfolio the first project you guys did together? It was the first project?
Yes.
Can you talk us through
Surely.
that process? Yeah.
Surely. When we did meet each other and did realize there were others that were experienced and at a level of photography that you could be comfortable to discuss, you decided, what are we going to do? And then we decided, why don't we all decide what kind of, or what area of photography that you'd like to deal with, what aspect of the photography. And we'll go and find some sort of, apply for some sort of grant that some people might be interested in. And I had been meeting a number of people that were involved in the administration of photography and magazine publishers. And they were helpful too and suggested how to start forming an organization. And so we would meet in some bar and we would discuss what we would do. And at one point said, okay, let's go for a grant. Let's go ask money for a grant so it could pay for our time to do this. Mm-hmm. And we did that. And lo and behold, they actually accepted it. We had good work to show. And so we started getting grants from the city, and then from the state, and then from the government. And each one was built up from the previous work that you had done. So you were gaining a reputation. And that was the beginning of En Foco when that started happening. And that's what you see on the walls. That was one of the first ones that was financed by the city of New York. The mayor, we had one of Roger Caban was working for the mayor's office. So he made sure that the mayor knew about us. Mm-hmm. And so we could apply for city funds to take time off from what we were doing. And most times we weren't doing photography because you either were a photographer or you were an assistant. If you weren't one of the two, you were, busy doing something else. Now we could concentrate. We got together and decided, all right, let's decide what it is we want to take pictures of. We decided, okay, you take this, you handle agriculture. A lot of Latinos were involved in agriculture in New York State. And say, all right, you take theater, the presentation, the bands, the dancers, the singers. Oh, okay. And you take this. Well, I don't want that. I just want to roll and discover. That's what I did.
That's it.
And that's what this work is. I just roamed and discovered.
What's very interesting, I think, about your work is, specifically, that is very focused. No, it's different schools, but everything is inside the school, except for a couple of images that right at in front of the schools or the protests that took place outside the school. But I think you had like a very strong focused view, to develop the work. So we did print some images to show to you, so maybe we can talk about some of them. Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, am I missing?
Yeah,
the
I'm
number
always very
one?
fascinated, about the space in your images, your sense of field depth. How there's like really a beautiful presence. Yeah, this image really totally illustrates that. Yeah, so maybe we should start from this one.
Well, this image for the cameras,
We'll have it beautiful.
We'll
yeah.
splice it, yeah.
you'll cut to a nice picture.
Yeah,
of
of course. You can count on that.
is of a corridor, a hallway in one of the schools. And the way I was working, I would introduce myself to the principal and show my portfolio of photography and tell them what we were doing in photography. We were primarily interested in the Latino involvement in schools. And they said, oh, sure, just don't make too much noise. And I said, yeah, and I don't think there are any flashes in this. I didn't use flash because that draws a great deal of attention to you. And while you're shooting this kind of imagery, it's a very sensitive thing that you feel more than you see. And you have to hang out, because otherwise it's just, why are you doing? You don't belong in this school. And so you hear about the photography. Oh yeah, let's go see if we can get his picture. And they didn't mind me walking around with a camera in my hands. And the way we work is very calmly and not going around pointing cameras at people. But whenever we saw the photograph in our heads, we just whip the camera up. And I always get the camera prepared for the standard lighting situations in schools and what that kind of exposure demanded, and how steady I would have to be, because it's fairly low level lighting.
Absolutely, and you're dealing with movement as well.
That's right, yeah. So there's timing all involved with this. But the most interesting thing is to not to be pointed out. You have to tell the teachers, this is what I'm doing here. Of course, the principal has to pay some stray guy coming in. And I would always clear it with upper levels, and I just hang out. I just lean against a wall and say hello, everyone. And the teachers got to know me.
I think there's a beautiful sense of the self-consciousness of your body and your camera, and how would that interact with all the other bodies in the space, no?
Yes.
I remember you said something when we spoke on the phone or on Zoom about waiting for something to happen, like for the bell to ring.
Oh, well.
So the kids would move in the corridor.
That's right.
And you would get the scene that you were looking for, right? So I guess there was like waiting. And,
there was a lot of that.
Yeah.
You'd select an area and say something's going to happen here. You just have to wait for the bell to ring. Well, everybody, got 5 minutes to run around, find the new classroom. But they always beat in the hallways, and they always get around, things like that. So if you're hanging there, not passing through, they go, oh yeah, you hear about that guy? Yeah, he's all right. He'll be taking pictures, but no flash. You know, you don't have to worry about him. He's not from the government.
So I guess the principal's advice was useful to you. No, don't make too much noise, right?
Absolutely, you know.
I wanted to ask you, because of the, you keep saying hanging out,
Mm-hmm.
and you have a beautiful series in the cafeteria, especially,
Yes.
where the children, I mean, they're high school kids, they're really shining, and they're fashion, they're so cool looking. So I wanted to know, maybe you could talk about, I mean, you had this background in fashion.
Yes.
So were you already looking for, we had spoken previously, you mentioned about looking for the beauty in the people.
Yeah, and well, that comes from the period. We were zoot zooters in the early days, and so we dressed according to that. How sharp you are, what kind of shoes you're wearing, what kind of jacket you're wearing, doing all the right things. So I understood that, and kids do the same thing. They have a fashion of their own that's very familiar to them. They know, much more than at the time I was in school. They're more conscious of fashion. I used a lot of that in witnessing things in the lunchrooms, in the hallways, in the stairways, because they're all changing classes and they're running about and they'll see you, hey, how you doing? So I was a familiar person in the school, and I had cleared it with the officials, so I'd have that permission to be hanging out. They weren't strangers in your school, and I'd have to show my portfolio prove to them that I was a professional. And so the kids didn't bother with me much. They heard about me, but they knew what I was there for, and I wasn't there to identify them for something naughty.
Well, and it's interesting to me, I mean, you were portraying the high school kids who I think a lot of them have a sense of self-awareness in the photographs, but then there's images like these with elementary school students. And I'm really interested in also how it looks like a lot of these schools were bilingual. I see a lot of signage in both English and Spanish. So I wanted to ask you about that.
That didn't exist when I was going to school. This bilingualism came much afterwards. So when I went back in school, I was amazed to see Spanish writing and how involved with it. Well, it occurred to the educators that you'd better be aware of the ethnicity of most of your students, and so you found what we didn't have in our time. You found Latina and Latinos teaching that wasn't present before, and it was very comforting. And they would be teaching with that sense of softness. That's part of our character. And
100%.
Yes. And you'd have to hang there for a while, because they have to get used to you being there. And pretty soon I got invisible because I'd be everywhere all the time. And they'd act up, and they didn't mind because I wasn't going to report them for anything.
Maybe on to the next one.
Yeah, I mean, this is almost a counter image to what we're just talking about.
Yes.
But, you were saying finally there's some Latina teachers. We're teaching bilingual education, but you also have these image of protests that were taking place at the school.
That was all new. It came years after I had been in school. And it was, we never had Latinos as teachers. They weren't present. There were other ethnicities, but they weren't Latinos. And by this time, we had moved into many neighborhoods, not just El Barrio, but we were down in Lower East Side. We were up in Fort Washington area, many places. And we began teaching in the schools. We found Latinos teaching in schools. We didn't see that when I was a kid. And so there'd always be, which we didn't see, police everywhere. I guess they had to be doing something.
But I think change comes with the struggle, and also there was always pressure for more representation, and I think that's the case with this process.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'd go to different schools. This is in Lower Manhattan, and when I was going to school, it was the Bronx. So then I moved back down into Manhattan, and I'd wander into different schools, and I'd get permission to be in there, and I'd just hang out, and maybe something was going on, and if it was, it was like this, I didn't care to really get involved with something like that, because this was so, how shall I say, the opposite. We didn't have police in our schools. Never had. Mm-hmm. No one ever thought of it. There was no reason for it. There had been a breakdown in the orderliness of the society, and they had to do this nonsense. And I was really disturbed about that, But I had to witness it, and I had to identify it. So I hung out sometimes when they had strikes or they had difficulties. Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that you said, I can take this. It's interesting that you said you didn't want to dwell too much in the protest, and I think those scenes are rare in the imagery. But I wanted to ask a little bit more about the activism that's sort of inherent in this project. I mean, you have a couple images of protests. In Felipe Dante, we see some men striking. So what was your goal with this portfolio? Were you protesting something? Were you trying to make visible something?
Well, we all picked different areas to work in. Phil knew about the garment industry. He was working in there. And Roger, who was new to photography, but he was serious about what he was doing, and some of the work he was showing showed the curiosity, and always looking for the individual's eye and how it's seeing things. If it's any different than what you're used to seeing, you're always looking for that difference. And so we gathered ourselves together and said, there are no Latino photographers. You don't ever hear about them. A lot of Europeans, but no Latino photographers. So that's why we decided to form some sort of force or make our ethnicity present in a more powerful way.
Yeah, I guess we wanted also to ask you about the relationship with El Museo and the donation, and how did the two entities interacted back then. So if you can just share with us a little bit about En Foco and El Museo, the relationship.
Yeah, but El Museo, I'm thinking, it wasn't this. It was in the neighborhood. And it was, there was no major structure meant for this. It was all community-based, and you were working with a small district of schools, of streets. And those teachers were Latinos, and the kids were Latinos, and there was a whole sense of Latinoism that was taking place. So everybody knew and felt that they were in a place that was protective of themselves.
And I mean, how did you get to know El Museo? How did you hear about it?
I can't remember her name now.
Marta Moreno Vega?
Who?
Marta Moreno Vega?
Marta. Yeah. I saw what she was doing. She was building a power and focusing on things that had to be focused. So I became interested in her because I saw that she was a powerful figure and had the ability to organize and make change. And we met because we would always be around different Latino events, and so we get to know each other.
I think we have a wonderful material. So I want to thank you so much for this interview, for the conversation, for sharing all your knowledge and all your passion and all your work with us. But before we finish, just wanted to ask you like a last thing. What did you feel? How did you feel when you saw these images almost 50 years after they were shot, hanging in the museum last night?
I thought, por fin. A lot of other people knew about my work, but
Por fin.
I didn't see much response from another generation that had come into place about the work. So I didn't particularly involve it, other than in the schools. Those beautiful young girls, their pretty dresses, it just overwhelmed me. But by that time I had gone back to Puerto Rico, you know, and I surrounded myself with the culture and I was filled with it. But I came back and I didn't feel the same way as when I first went. I just felt back with my family. Yeah. It was entirely different after our living in Puerto Rico.
Were you surprised by seeing any of these images last night?
Oh yes, they brought back so many memories. And there was a period, look at that, there was a period when this was just forming, when we were just moving into positions that might affect the power structure. We didn't have anything like that. We were being treated and had no say in what was going on, but it's changed. It's changed. We see more of our faces there.